1846. The Englishman Henry Fox Talbot is photographing one of his friends. Partners is photographing a statue of the Three Graces, while another is photographing an old engraving. Capturing an exact image from real life was totally new at the time. Talbot's first experiments date back to 1830. He called them photogenic drawings. A plant was placed on a sheet of paper that had been coated in cooking salt and silver nitrate solution. Plant and paper were then exposed to the light, and the photosensitive paper darkened all around the plant, which acted like a mask. There was no intention of creating a composition, and no special effects were sought. Just the simple pleasure of seeing, under the action of the light on the silver salts, a dream come true. A 15,000-year-old dream dating back to the age when Neolithic man placed these handprints on the walls of a cave, their contours fixed by a mixture of pigments and saliva. But just like these Neolithic stencils, Talbot's photogenic drawings were still only imprints, mere shadows. The real image of reality, with its solids and hollows, appeared in 1839. It was the daguerreotype, named after the Frenchman Daguerre. The image captured on a copper plate was remarkably clear and precise, but it was a single image that could not be reproduced or modified. It was to remain forever exactly as it was taken, transformed only by the passage of time, oxidation, and scratches. A few months later, Talbot perfected the calotype. The image was captured on a simple sheet of paper coated in silver iodide. It was a negative image, the blacks and whites appearing in inverse fashion. This original image was then placed on another sheet of sensitive paper and exposed to the light, producing a positive image, the print. The disassociation between the negative and the positive, which was to determine photographic practices for the next 150 years, was a critical step. A single original negative could now enable multiple prints to be created and their color and density to be modified. Photography was no longer a simple technique involving the fixing of an image of reality. It could now interpret that reality. In a book setting out the merits of his process, Talbot reproduced as an example this photograph of a china collection. Taken in just a few seconds, it could, he stated, replace tedious inventories and be used as evidence in the event of breakage or theft. For Talbot, however, photography was not all about documentary precision. We can admire the sharpness of this calotype, in which any one straw can be distinguished from the rest of the haystack in direct sunlight. But what makes the image so remarkable is the opposition between the dimensions of the haystack and the diagonal of a ladder placed there very probably by the photographer. It is a compositional work, as is this other photograph entitled The Ladder. Very probably the same one. The ladder and its shadow, positive and negative. According to Talbot, the photographer should look at the world through the eyes of an artist, even if that meant taking advice from a real artist, as he did for this photograph entitled The Open Door. The parallel alignment of the diagonal of the shadow and of the broom handle is too perfect to be entirely natural. At the same time, the Frenchman Hippolyte Bayard took this image, also along a diagonal, in the tradition of grand paintings. It is a self-portrait of the artist as a corpse, according to the title written by Bayard. He drowned in despair as the photographic process he had invented did not gain recognition. His head and hands are starting to rot. It was the first time a photographer played on the apparent authenticity of the photograph in order to create a fiction. Between documentary and crafted settings, photography posed questions on its real nature right from the beginning. It's hard to imagine something more basic than the cameras that took these images. Simple wooden boxes equipped with lenses, with a manually operated shutter speed using a cork or a valve. Exposure time was calculated by guesswork. There was no photographic industry. Each photographer made their own paper, constantly seeking to improve the formula. The albumen paper for positive prints that appeared towards 1850 required dozens of whipped egg whites. The mixture was left to sit for 24 hours before the albumen that had been deposited at the bottom of the recipient was collected. Then the sheet of paper was dipped into it and was hung to drain and to dry. It was in France and in England that this home-crafted photography developed most rapidly, attracting above all painters, who saw in it the possibility of steering their careers in a new direction. Others took a few lessons and set up as photographers during overseas travels, such as writer Maxime Ducamp in Egypt in 1850. Ducamp brought back frontal view images without any decoration or local color. The only concession to the picturesque is the Nubian ferryman who climbed up the monuments to give an idea of their scale. Due to their low sensitivity, paper negatives still needed several dozen seconds more exposure time, as they were too slow to capture movement, or life as it really was. A simple passerby would leave no trace on the image, unless he stopped for a moment, and when he carried on his way, left behind him his transparent ghost. But early photography produced marvels with all that was motionless, which it captured with an accuracy and precision that neither drawing nor painting could equal. In France, the leading photographers naturally turned to photographing architecture. This was the case for Edouard Baldus, the author of this image of the Church of the Madeleine in Paris. With 5 other photographers, Baldus's services were engaged in 1851 for one of the most ambitious projects in the history of 19th century photography, a vast state-commissioned photographic inventory of French architectural heritage, to be carried out by the most well-known photographers of the period. In addition to Edouard Baldus, there was Hippolyte Bayard, Henri Le Sec, Gustave Le Gray, and Olivier Mestral. They were paid 5,000 francs each at the time, and they traveled all over the country for a year, photographing 175 monuments, churches, chateaux, and public constructions. When their photographs were handed over to the administration, they disappeared for over a century into a bottomless pit of archives. But Baldus, like others, carried on the work on his own account and published magnificent albums of original prints of his photographs of monuments. Today, these images might seem banal, but at the time, they provoked astonishment and admiration. For the first time, without leaving their homes, people could see the world as it really was, or at least, so they thought. The Saint-Trophime cloisters at Arles, photographed by Baldus. It is a meticulous image and was strictly impossible to produce with the techniques available at the time. It was, in fact, a combination of 10 different negatives, all focused and exposed in relation to the place they occupied in the perspective. Baldus could not produce it any other way. His lens could not frame the vault and the ground at the same time. There is no way to balance differences in light and contre-jour, nor to achieve clarity throughout the depth of the image. The negatives were cut and stuck together, and retouches were used to mask the joins and to reinforce certain details. some parts, like the vault, are just simply painted. Baldus was not seeking to deceive when he carried out these operations. He simply wanted to reproduce what his eye could see, but his camera couldn't capture. The same technical constraints obliged photographer Gustave Le Gray to alter his seaside images. The difference in brightness between the surface of the water and the sky was too marked. To capture the texture and the shimmering of the sea, the photographer had to overexpose the sky, which as a result was devoid of matter and relief. But he had another image, a fine cloud-filled sky above a totally underexposed sea. He isolated the sky and placed it over his shimmering sea, thus obtaining a spectacular image, which was entirely lifelike, even though it had never existed. For his seascapes, Gustave Le Gray used another process which appeared towards 1850, the collodion process. He was one of the inventors of this technique, which produced very sharp negatives with a rich palette of grays. Collodion is cotton powder, a powerful explosive dissolved in ether. The mixture was spread onto a glass plate, which replaced paper. The quality of the negative depended on how evenly the layer had been spread, which required a good deal of dexterity. But the greatest constraint was that the glass plate had to be prepared in the minutes preceding the shooting and had to be developed straight after it. A delicate and risky technique, as exemplified by the destiny of this fly, trapped forever in the wet collodion of this photograph taken in Russia 150 years ago. For outdoor shots, the constraints of wet collodion obliged photographers to carry mobile laboratories around with them, like this photographic cart belonging to a photographer from Toulouse who used it to travel to Lourdes and take pictures of the pilgrims there. Or even more imposing, the photographic wagon that the Englishman Roger Fenton used during the Crimean War in 1854. It was the first time that a photographer had covered a war. The sheer bulk of his camera and the lack of sensitivity of the negatives prevented him from photographing combat. Most of his photographs show soldiers relaxing. Some of them are lying down, which made it easier for them to hold their pose. Others are frozen in carefully staged mock gestures and postures. The Valley of the Shadow of Death, Fenton's most famous image, made good use of this motionlessness. It is a ravine littered with cannonballs that did not make it to enemy lines. But the image does not show that. All that remains is this desolate and sinister view, stripped of its background story. Printing the positive took place in the open air by contact. The negative was enclosed in a wooden frame with the positive paper, and the sun, when it came out, did the rest. The young actress Sarah Bernhardt, photographed by Félix Nadar. It may not have been easy to use wet collodion outdoors, but it was perfectly suited to studio portraits. A former caricaturist, Félix Nadar knew better than any other how to exploit its potential. From 1854, he created about 100 portraits. the glass negatives of which are still in prime condition today. Artists like Gustave Courbet, poets, and friends like Charles Baudelaire. Baudelaire did not like photography. He found its accuracy obscene, leaving no place for either imagination or art. Ironically, Nadar kept this other portrait of Baudelaire in his archives, a blurred image, which technically was a failure, but which managed to capture in its very imperfection what Nadar called the intimate likeness. Nadar's portraits went straight to the point. No background or contrivances marred the relationship between photographer, light, and model. There are no artistic photographs, he said. In photography, as in everything, there are people who can see and those who don't even know how to look. For others, on the contrary, photography could only be artistic. 1856. The young photography giving the painter an additional brush. The author of this allegory, the Englishman Oscar Rejlander, relied heavily on theatrical staging and photomontage to create enlightening images that could rival painting. Head of St. John the Baptist, 1858, in a charger. Less improbable, but just as doctored, was this scene entitled Street Urchins Tossing Chestnuts. The young child's eyes are following the path of the chestnut in mid-flight. But in 1857, photography was incapable of capturing such a rapid movement. The chestnut was in fact suspended on the end of a thread that was later removed with a retouch. In order to determine the exposure time of his photographs, Rejlander allegedly measured the light by observing the dilation and contraction of his cat's pupil. In 1857, for his most ambitious and most famous work, he is said to have made use of the animal at least 30 times. He did indeed photograph 30 groups of people separately, then assembled the negatives he had obtained to create a composition that sought to rival, by its complexity at least, the major Italian Renaissance paintings. As the positive was printed by contact, there was no possibility of enlarging it, so he had to proceed methodically. To construct a logical perspective, he first photographed and placed all the foreground figures. Using their measurements, he calculated the size of the figures in the second row, and then the third. It took him 6 weeks to finish this vast scene in a studio with a surface area of only a few square meters and lit solely by natural light. The background has also been altered. The great drape was a small curtain. The columns, walls, and the backdrop are drawings, a few dozen centimeters tall. The work, which measures 78 centimeters by 40, is entitled The Two Ways of Life. It features on the right the path of virtue, consisting of study, chastity, charity, and repentance. On the left is the path of vice, where excess, lust, gaming, and other frivolities reign. In the middle, a father and his 2 sons with totally opposing tastes. The image was a tremendous success. Queen Victoria bought a copy of it. But portraying real women naked caused a scandal. In Edinburgh, the picture was exhibited with the left part covered up. In another print, Rejlander was asked to correct the position of the father's head to make him look to the right side. Henry Peach Robinson, who also trained as a painter, used the same technique to produce a stranger result. This apparently unremarkable scene, in which each character was photographed separately, was the only way to ensure that they were all sharp and well lit by natural light. They were all placed in the same room using a montage, while at the same time each character was left alone in their own space. It was this image that made Robinson famous in 1858. It has an enigmatic title, Fading Away, but we do not know why. At the time, critics spoke of tuberculosis, but Robinson had sold separately one of the studies for the figure of the young dying girl bearing the title, She Never Told Her Love. Another window, looking onto a moonlit sea. Two children are sleeping in the room bathed in daylight, making it totally unreal. The Sleep by Robinson, 1858. The montage of the various elements creates an imaginary world as it is too clear and too bright. We can see everything, but we don't know where we are, nor who these children are. Nor do we know why the black shoes are there. They are strangely large and given prominence as though to balance out the white flowers. The most troubling aspect is the accumulation of all these details in the same shot. Seeing all these things together at the same time is only possible in a dream. In the real world, which French photographers preferred, soft focus made a comeback. Charles Nègre's Paris market scene at the port near the Hôtel de Ville, 1851. The blurred figures' movements and the blurred depth of field of the houses in the background give the photograph a depth of movement, which is that of life itself. The same is true in this photograph by Henri Le Sec from 1850. In which the blur of the trees transforms them into one simple background, highlighting the mineral strength of the rocks in the forest of Fontainebleau. Images in which the photographer chooses not to show everything, sacrificing the incidental for the essential, and where darkness can compete with light, as in this other photograph by Le Sec, so that photography is not a mere copy of reality. So true it's false, in Delacroix's words. Portrait of Marie-Laurent by Nadar, 1856. Towards 1860, Nadar made an even more radical choice. Having produced about 100 portraits, he lost interest in photography and turned to air travel, balloon flights, and the first helicopter prototypes. And he was not alone. As though they had all passed the word around, practically all the major French and English photographers who had fought for their art to be recognized abandoned photography at the end of the decade. Roger Fenton, a lawyer by training, sold all his equipment and went back to law. Oscar Rejlander went back to painting, as did Henri Le Sec. Others, such as Charles Nègre and Hippolyte Bayard, ceased all activity and fell into oblivion. It was the end of a dream, the end of the adventure for this generation of handyman artists who Nadar referred to as the primitives of photography. It was the end of a golden age in which everything had been waiting to be created and everything had seemed possible. an exceptional 10-year interlude between the time photography was invented and the time it became an industry.